All right, so the reality of how this doesn't work. In the last 45 years, Congress has made this work properly 4 times. 4 times. The other thing that's part of this is the government sometimes hides stuff, what we call off budget. So the post office isn't part of the budget. Okay? Just not part of the budget. It's off to the side. So Congress can decide that some functions are not going to be part of the budget. They put them off to the side, and then that's a whole different thing. The Bush administration after 9/11, the $4 trillion cost of fighting the war in Afghanistan and going into Iraq and all that was never included as part of the budget. It was always off budget. It was a side item. When Obama became president, one of the things that he did was he moved all that stuff on budget. So the budget included the ongoing expenses in Afghanistan and Iraq, which it hadn't done under that. Okay? Now, it's important to understand the Constitution does not require the federal government to balance its budget. Founding fathers may have had a opinion that was just so understood that, and there's a reason why you don't want to balance the budget necessarily, right? Let's suppose that the economy goes south. The economy is bad. Lots of people are losing their jobs. Well, when you lose your jobs, you're not making any income. You're not paying any income tax. So taxes are going to fall. Okay? The federal government, to balance its budget, would have to cut Social Security. It would have to cut defense spending. It would have to cut and cut and cut. And we'll talk about that. They don't want to cut a lot. In fact, they want to increase spending when the economy turns bad because now they've got unemployment payments to make and they've got more welfare payments to make. And so the federal budget actually sometimes goes up when the economy is bad. So federal government budget's going up and taxes are going down. States, on the other hand, are required to balance their budgets. So we had a huge recession in 2008, 9, 10. During that recession, the state of Nevada had to balance its budget. They cut the budget of the universities by 35% because they have to cut something. They have to balance the budget, and they have to choose. So they cut K-12 a little bit. They cut us a lot. They cut the highway patrol a little bit. They cut us a lot. All the people who worked for the state had to take a 5% pay cut. Eventually we got the 5% back, but not the money that they hadn't paid us. States have to balance their budget, right? During the Great Depression, which is before all of our times, but back in the 1930s, the state of Nevada paid its workers half in cash and half with bonds. And then the state workers basically never got the money from the bonds, so they were paid half. Most states in the United States did the same thing. They paid you half with money and then half with a bond, a piece of paper that says the state of Nevada owes you. Some investors would come sometimes to the state employees and buy their bonds up from them at maybe half of what their face value was. So the state worker might end up with 75% of their income rather than 50%. But the state has to balance its budget. The federal government does not. During COVID, all the states, especially Nevada, right? Nevada's half of our revenue. We'll talk about this when we get to Nevada. But basically half of the revenue the state of Nevada takes in is from tourists. All of a sudden we had no tourists. We didn't have to cut much, though, because the federal government, between Trump and Biden, and we'll talk about that eventually. So Trump does something called the CARES Act, and then Biden does the Recovery Act. And between the two of them, they transfer millions and millions and billions of dollars to the states so the states can try to keep their budgets balanced. So we took a little bit of a hit during COVID budget-wise, but not nearly as bad as we did in 2008, 2009. Okay? But some. So we get that. The federal government does not have to balance its budget. The states do have to balance their budgets. And for the most part, cities, counties, all those local governments, they all have to balance their budget. Now, saying that is not quite accurate. And again, we'll talk about that when we get to states. So when the federal government wants to build an aircraft carrier, They just, here's $10 billion and go build the aircraft carrier. When they want to build a building, they just say, oh, here's $100 million, go build that building. States have separate budgets for operating expenses and for what we call capital expenses. So a state is going to build a building. They issue bonds. When we built Student Union, we sold bonds. Investors bought the bonds. And over 30 years, we pay off the Student Union. So in a sense, the state of Nevada still goes into debt, right? We still have, in a federal sense, an unbalanced budget. But we balance the operating budget, and then we spend money, borrowed money, in the capital budget, which we slowly pay back. So the federal government, if they were a private corporation, their accounting system would be illegal. If they were a state or any other thing but the federal government, their accounting system would be illegal. They're supposed to separate out that capital from the operating, but they don't. It makes the whole thing just kind of wacky. So, in light of all the budget problems that we have, the fact that Congress loves to cut taxes, but not at the same time they're increasing spending, and so you have a big problem. They've done two things to try to balance the budget. The first was called PAYGO, which stands for Pay As You Go. It's in the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. So who was president in 1990 was H.W. Bush. Okay? And all it says, if you want to do something new, if you want to create a new program, you have to pay for it. So if you want to start a new, say, a drug benefit in Medicare, which they wanted to start, you would have had to pay for it. You would have had to come up with the tax dollars to pay for the drug benefit, or you would have had to cut something else in the federal budget to pay for the drug benefit. Nobody wants to do that. So we had the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. It existed until 2003. Under President Clinton, who was president from, he was January 1993 until December, or January really, of 2001, we actually balanced the budget. The last few years of the Clinton administration, we actually were generating a budget surplus, and we were paying off the national debt. And in fact, there was a plan, and if they continued along that plan, we were 10 years, not even 10 years probably, from paying off the entire national debt. Okay? But the second Bush administration comes in, and they blow this thing up. They kill PAYGO officially in 2003, technically born again in 2010, but nobody listens to it. So we passed what's called the Budget Control Act of 2011, and it was a negotiation. Again, the Republicans shut the government down. This Budget Control Act is a negotiation that happened to get the government started again. Okay? And what it does is it says certain programs. It doesn't apply to Social Security. It doesn't apply to the Defense Department. It doesn't apply to the National. It doesn't apply to. But to everything that it applies to, there's a limit to how much spending can increase from year to year. And if Congress can't figure out how to do the budget, then that cap holds, and there's a set limit on spending, and it's called sequestration because that means some of the money is gathered up and sequestered. It's put aside. It's put away. So it's a way to control the speed at which the budget increases by taking some money away from departments if Congress can't figure out how to pass a budget. So Congress can't do a budget. Some departments in the administration, in the federal government, have their money taken away. Some of their money taken away. It's sequestered. Okay? And you can look and see how much money is sequestered each year if you feel like it. So we used to use PAYGO, and now we use sequestration, but sequestration really, since it doesn't apply to most of the government, it's not that helpful. Okay? So again, just to remind ourselves, the enumerated powers, the flaky enumerated powers, which are somewhat implied powers. So let's see. Building post offices and roads is in the Constitution. So that nobody disagrees with the idea the federal government can build post offices and that it can build something like the interstate highway system. Okay? It can fund the Supreme Court, and it can fund all the lesser courts we want to fund. It can fund the Army. It can fund the Navy. It can fund state militias. Okay? Now, it doesn't mention the Air Force or the Space Force, but you'll see there's, we talked about this before, there's some parts of the Constitution that we kind of just, doesn't apply because in the modern world things are different. So a state militia would be the National Guard. Remember that the Founding Fathers did not want the federal government, to have a standing army. They wanted the states to have the army. The federal government would have the Navy, and the states would have the army. That way, a whacked-out president couldn't have the army go out and seize voting machines or take over something, right? The states are in control of the army. So if you go to the Civil War, the units in the Civil War, right? The Battle of Gettysburg is decided by a conflict between a group of soldiers from Maine and a group of soldiers from Alabama. And the Maine soldiers beat up and killed most of the Alabama soldiers. And that happens on Little Round Top, and it saves the Union in the Battle of Gettysburg. But it's the Maine versus Alabama. Okay, it's not the U.S. Army versus the Confederate Army. It's the Maine militia versus the Alabama militia. Right? The Founding Fathers, I think, uniformly would be spinning around in their graves if they knew we had a couple of million people constantly in the military. The Constitution says Congress can provide for a national capital, can have other federal property like Yosemite. It can coin money. We already talked about that a lot. And it can protect intellectual property. It can create patents and copyrights and all that kind of stuff. Then it says the government can regulate commerce. Well, what exactly do that mean? Right? There's an implied something there, and it doesn't really say what they meant by that. Regulate the value of money. Okay, good. How do we do that? Doesn't say. Deal with pirates. Yay. So Congress has the right to deal with pirates and some other stuff, but again, kind of flaky. And then it says everything necessary and proper for all the powers provided and provide for the general welfare. So what's necessary and proper? It's a very vague phrase. And we have the courts, right? And again, I'm not picking on President Trump because I'm picking on President Trump. If you had taken this class a bunch of years ago, I'd have been picking on President Biden or picking on President Trump or picking on President Vida, whoever's. But when his press secretary says courts don't have the right to tell the executive branch, well, of course they do. The whole point of the Constitution is that you have checks and balances. So if the executive branch is doing something that they are not legally entitled to do, either by the Constitution or by law, it is the court's job to tell them you are not legally entitled to do that. Okay? So what is necessary and proper has been defined more by courts over the last 230 years than by Congress, right? And sometimes the courts are very lenient with Congress, and they say, well, look, if Congress wants to do that, then we're going to take that to be necessary and proper. And sometimes the courts have said, no, you're really stretching, and we don't want you to do that. But it's the courts that end up determining a lot of what's in the Constitution. The Founding Fathers intended Congress to do it more, but we all know that Congress doesn't sometimes do what they're supposed to do. And so they leave it to the courts to decide. But clearly it's the job of the courts to figure out what's legal and not legal about what the executive branch is doing.